While watching Apocalypse Hotel, there was one scene in particular that really stuck with me. In episode 11, Yachio, a robot specifically made to serve as a hotel concierge, after hundreds of years of working, is finally forced to take a day off. With some unprecedented free time on her hands, she chooses to spend her time doing a bit of self-maintenance. But before she embarks on her journey, she just sits. As she restlessly scans the hotel lobby, unsure of what to do with herself, she watches silently as the world continues to move. Even without her intervention, everything carries on business as usual. She's confronted with the quiet reality that the hotel that she was created for doesn't need her anymore. And in that moment, watching a robot built to replace humans confront the existential crisis of being replaced herself, everything clicked into place. Apocalypse Hotel isn't just a funny story about robots and aliens after the end of the world. It's a meditation on cultural memory, population collapse, and what it even means to be Japanese, to be human. But let's take a step back and start from the beginning. Apocalypse Hotel is an original anime that aired in spring 2025. Its production was handled by Cygames Pictures and is the brainchild of studio president and self-proclaimed jokester Nobuhiro Takanaka, who pitched the idea around 2020 as a story about an extraterrestrial life form coming to a hotel run by robots on an Earth where humanity has disappeared. It follows a hotel in the Ginza district of Tokyo 100 years after a virus makes it impossible for humans to breathe, and they escape on interstellar arcs in a mass exodus from Earth. And already you can probably see the significance that the pandemic had on its production just through its premise. But notably, one thing that really rose to prominence during the lockdowns was the concept of liminal spaces. The sight of once populated environments now completely devoid of life really captured people's imaginations and led to the spread of things like the backrooms. But a liminal space is not just a creepy, empty place that should be full of people like you may have assumed based on its usage. Liminality refers to the transitional phase individuals experience when moving between two distinct stages of life and embodies a state of uncertainty and transformation. In Apocalypse Hotel, with the absence of humanity, the entire world is essentially just one big liminal space. Cities that were once bustling with people are now in the process of being reclaimed by nature. And much like other post-apocalyptic stories, those that are left now have to try to define who they are, removed from the pretense of the pre-existing social order. But in a world without people, where does one even begin to try and orientate themselves? Well, fittingly enough, the show chooses to begin its journey as many travelers do, at a hotel. Hotels themselves represent a sort of liminal space. When you think of a hotel, you think of tourists and a cultural exchange of sorts. It's in this perpetual limbo state of arrivals and departures, business and leisure, foreign and familiar. Even the architecture can oftentimes blur boundaries with its sort of hybrid construction, and occupy a sort of in-between state of two cultures by combining elements from different traditions into a single whole. They are, by design, out of place and out of time, and not somewhere that one is meant to stay forever. The Gingaro Hotel, where the cast resides and works, is distinctly a very Western-style hotel. From its sofas and love seats to its marble floors and chandeliers, it runs in very stark contrast to the sort of decor you would expect from a traditional Japanese hotel. Even the owner is an almost stereotypical image of Western otherness with his blonde hair and blue eyes. And yet, this hotel that wouldn't look out of place in Victorian England is almost taken for granted as being a Japanese hotel. Its Western aesthetic is normalized, even as its appearance subtly contradicts national tradition. Interestingly, the hotel is based on the real-life Ginzawako, which is not actually a hotel at all, but a high-end department store. So the decision to outfit its interior in the style of a European grand hotel is both intentional and revealing. So then, what is a hotel in a world without people? As David Harvey once suggested, it's social practices and process that create spaces, and that spaces are essentially something that is brought into being according to how it is used, surveyed, and invested with symbolic significance. In other words, a space isn't defined strictly by its physical architecture, but by the actions performed within it and the meaning behind them. The Gingaro Hotel is not a hotel simply because it once was, but because its staff continues to treat it as such. The rituals that the robots have maintained all these years are what preserve its identity, and it's through that foundation that both the characters and the audience are able to find a familiar cultural frame with which to orientate themselves in an unfamiliar world. Much like how a familiarly furnished hotel might offer comfort in a foreign country, the Gingaro Hotel becomes a sort of symbolic anchor. And it's through that framing that we can begin to see the show's commentary on our modern day. You see, the robots of the Gingaro Hotel aren't only meant to be the avatar through which we view the world after humanity is gone, they also act as a sort of allegory for the Japanese populace. They're living what Miyadai Shinji would call a sort of endless everyday. Being robots, they don't need to struggle to survive, and as a result, they live in relative comfort, aimlessly repeating their daily rituals. They're also unable to repopulate themselves. We see over time their numbers continue to dwindle as each robot is placed on indefinite leave, but they are unable to replace them. This mirrors the potential population collapse that looms over Japan in the modern day. Which leads us to ask the uncomfortable question, if the worst were to happen, what would that mean for the Japanese identity? It's pretty much a staple for apocalyptic literature to pose these sorts of questions of identity. Japan Sinks, for instance, goes as far as to ask the question of what it means to be Japanese if the entire country of Japan were to disappear. But Apocalypse Hotel almost asks a more haunting question. What if all that was left was the country of Japan and the echoes of its culture? We begin to see these questions addressed when the hotel receives its first guest in a century. A sentient plant-like life form that arrives in a strange winged pod. Their ship's design evokes the image of a seed drifting through space, which brings to mind the idea of panspermia, but more evocatively, it recalls the alchemic symbol of the round chaos, a chaotic, formless state from which transformation begins. It's a fitting image of liminality for this moment that something new begins to take root in the ruins of the old. But what matters most about this guest isn't who he is or the design of his spaceship, but how he's received. We see that over the course of the show, Yachio's worldview begins to shift in small, deliberate steps. When the hotel's regulations fail to account for an extraterrestrial guest, she adapts and they expand the definition of guest to include those not from Earth. While the environment checker robot sees their guest as a potential threat as he wanders around performing incomprehensible actions, Yachio chooses to respond with hospitality and respect. And it's that single choice, to treat him as a guest rather than as an intruder, and to earnestly seek understanding rather than close themselves off to any future possibilities, is what plants the seed for everything to follow. And that is where we're introduced to the Tanukians. Forced from their homeworld after a planet-wide dispute has left it covered in shit, they arrive on Earth as refugees. While they initially try to pass as human, they're quickly exposed as a race of Tanuki-like aliens. Yet, despite the deception, Yachio doesn't hesitate to welcome them as guests. Now, their being Tanuki is significant, as throughout Japanese folklore, animals like foxes and Tanuki have long served as an objectified other on which to project the fears and desires of the human self. As shapeshifters, there's naturally elements of identity exploration at play. Since they take on human form and are only revealed through sort of purity tests, it externalizes the internal struggle of identity. But crucially, because they are animals which can neither write or speak, they can't really occupy the role of colonizer. Rather, they enact the role of the other in a more extreme fashion than even the colonized. In effect, the distinct culture that the animals represent is really a space within humans can inscribe their own questions about identity. The most immediate example in anime that comes to mind is Takahata's Ponpoko, in which the Tanuki wage a doomed resistance against the relentless sprawl of urban development. This places a significance on Yachio's decision to welcome them despite their trickery. In traditional folk tales, like those collected in the Honshokoji Nenshu, imposters are typically unmasked and driven away, with the boundary of human and animal reaffirmed. But in Apocalypse Hotel, Yachio's hospitality towards them begins to quietly question the idea of what it even means to be human at all. But almost paradoxically, these Tanukis are aliens, which in science fiction are almost always coded as colonizers. They tend to reflect our collective anxieties of retribution against humanity by a more technologically advanced civilization doing to us as we as a species have done to so many others throughout our history. And yet, the Tanukians aren't invaders. They're refugees. They themselves are liminal figures, transitioning from one culture to another, from one identity to something not yet formed. It's that emerging identity that begins to take shape over the course of the next few episodes. What starts off as a conflict in values slowly gives way to a cultural exchange. Ponko, the daughter of the Tanukian family, takes an interest in the customs of the hotel staff and even begins to share them with her family. After an encounter with a more physically imposing threat that challenges their place in the food chain, Ponko comes to appreciate that not everything is a given. Technological superiority does not guarantee survival or ensure belonging. This reminder of the fragility of existence leads to her adopting the Japanese custom of saying itadakimasu to show gratitude and respect for the lives they're consuming before a meal, and even sharing this practice with the rest of her family. And this is more than just mimicry, as it reflects a growing reverence for the values behind the ritual. But this appreciation of Earth customs extends beyond just the dinner table. After seeing how alcohol can help people to bond and recognizing its social function, Ponko and her family work together with the staff towards the common goal of crafting whiskey. This shared goal allows for a sense of community and camaraderie, becoming a sort of symbolic act of integration. And so it's no coincidence that after this episode, the Tanukians move out of the hotel, having finally crossed the threshold from refugees to residents. And this new transformation culminates in Ponko's wedding, a ceremony that reflects a new identity as it integrates both Tanukian and Earth traditions in both a wedding and funeral rites, acting as a farewell to what was while embracing what's to come. A sort of paradox of beginnings and endings that mirrors not only their evolving sense of self, but also the inherent liminality of the hotel. And this is where the show begins to shift focus, with the Tanukians now fully integrated into Earth's culture and helping to spread that culture among themselves and others. The question of identity now turns inward. After an unforeseen turn during a mission in space that leaves Yachio adrift in low Earth orbit for a couple of decades, she returns to find the hotel thriving without her, and her sense of identity begins to unravel. Despite her efforts having been the catalyst for much of the success, her proximity to it all had blinded her to the actual scale of change that had been unfolding around her. It wasn't until distancing herself, both spatially and temporally, that those transformations appeared stark and alien. To Yachio, this was no longer the hotel she had fought so long to preserve. Struggling to fit in, her first instinct is to dismantle the unfamiliar, in an attempt to reclaim her place in this space and move beyond her. Ultimately, though, her inevitable return was not a restoration of what was, but a reconciliation with change. Much like the Tanukians before her, she learns that identity isn't something to preserve in stasis, but something continuously reshaped in response to change. This realization only deepens when the first human finally returns to Earth. In the 600 years since their departure, not only had Yachio's idea of what it meant to be an Earthling changed, but humanity had changed as well. After generations spent adrift, Earth was no longer truly their home. The culture Yachio had spent centuries preserving now seemed alien to the very people who left it behind. National and cultural identities are not set in stone. What it meant to be Japanese in the Edo period bears little resemblance to its identity today. Culture transforms and evolves. What matters most isn't the preservation of signifiers, but the inheritance of the values behind them. We are not solely defined by the roles we play or the rituals we perform, but by the meaning that we breathe into them, the connections we make, and the bonds we share with others. To be a hotelier isn't just to look and act like one, it's to embody the spirit of hospitality through empathy. And in staying true to that spirit, Yachio's view of the world expanded. Her efforts to understand and welcome others had gradually reshaped how she viewed her own culture. The boundaries that had once defined what she valued gradually eroded. The success of a hotel doesn't hinge on shampoo hats. It rests on the sincerity of those trying to understand others. Really, when you think about it, the world itself is like a hotel. We're all just transient visitors passing through, and no one's meant to stay forever. Someone else may have built the space, but it's those within that space that give it its value, who give it life.
生きている感じがしました。